Hello, everyone. This is the 265th episode of Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. For this episode, I welcome back American author Mr. Hal Phillips as we discuss his book, Sibling Rivalry: How Mexico and the US Built the Most Contentious Codependent Feud in World Soccer. Mr. Phillips is also the author of Generation Zero, Founding Fathers, Hidden Histories, and Making of Soccer in America that we did a podcast on, I believe, in a couple of years back now. So, welcome back, Hal.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Sean.
Thank you. So, let's get into this book. Now, due to geographical and cultural reasons, one might assume that in soccer terms, USA and Mexico have always been rivals. However, that was not always the case. Now, before we get into the onset of this rivalry, we have to put in perspective the place and history of the game in each nation. Can you describe the cultural place of soccer or football in each nation for much of its history?
That's a big question, but we'll jump right in. In one way, I think I was surprised to learn, and readers will be surprised to learn, sort of how closely the histories of the two nations as soccer nations tracked. They developed in a more sort of closely aligned, similar way than I would have thought before I did the research. But in other ways, they're completely different. But FIFA had a lot to do with the similarities. And that's because in 1988, FIFA sort of went against the grain and awarded the World Cup to the United States, and the rest of the developed soccer world was aghast. They couldn't believe that FIFA would do this, but FIFA was smart. There can be a little evil, but they're not dumb. They saw that this was a lot of money to be made in the United States and that this was a black hole on the map of soccer. So that really led to, the burgeoning of the sport in this country and the rivalry with Mexico. But the same thing happened with Mexico in 1960. That country loved football, but at that time there was as much bullfighting or baseball or, on TV that there was soccer. By the end of the decade, when the World Cup that FIFA awarded to Mexico took place, soccer was number one. And I think that the most important thing to know about that is that exposure. People watch things on television, they become attached to them. But this was the one area where Mexico beat up on Big Brother pretty consistently, like every time. And they loved that about soccer. They loved that it was on TV. Mexico had always taken to soccer in a big way, unlike this country, but it was also the one area where they could dominate the United States. So FIFA gave them that opportunity to grow into a modern football nation. FIFA gave the United States the same opportunity. And the way I think about it and the way I write about it is that the United States has always been about 20 years behind. Their World Cup happened in the 1970s, ours happened in 1994. But by 1994, the U.S. had caught up. And since that time, we've developed together. And one of the things that I think is most striking about their relationship today is that we really share a common soccer ecosystem with Mexico. We, have these two leagues that now cooperate in ways that is totally unprecedented in world football. We have both countries raising up and competing for the same talented men and women to play on the national teams. It's really a codependent relationship that I'd never really thought about until I got into the research. But Mexico and the United States have developed in different ways, but they're both North American giants. They share the same continent, and their developments are very similar.
For historical reasons, soccer, football has always been more part of the national fabric of Mexico. Therefore, as you said, Mexico had a head start going to the beginning and their first encounter in 1934 and into the 1970s. And astonishingly, this 1934 match, which was a World Cup qualifier, would be the sole United States victory for decades. Can you describe the evolution of the game? And you somewhat did it in a way, but sort of domestically, can you describe the evolution of the game as we go through the post-war era into the NASL in America, but also the rise of the Mexican club game, and that coincided also with the 1970 World Cup? And it's fair to say that Mexico did not look to the United States as a rival. So, what were the relations in soccer terms in this era, this post-war era into the 70s?
Well, They first played in 1934. And at that time, there was absolutely no evidence that Mexican soccer was superior to U.S. soccer. That didn't really happen until 1937. Both national team programs started at about the same time. But in 1930, when they held the first World Cup, the U.S. was a seeded team. Mexico played 3 games and went home. The U.S. made the semifinal. They weren't, I think a threat to win that. But in 1934, when they played a playoff to get into the 1934 World Cup in Italy, the U.S. won the game. No one was surprised by that. And 3 years later, everything had sort of flipped. That was when Mexico hosted the United States for 3 friendlies, and they won each one by huge scores. Basically, what happened was from that moment forward, Mexico took off as a soccer nation, and the United States sort of went backwards for about 3 decades. And so that period right after World War II was just a mess for U.S. soccer. And all the while, Mexico is beating the U.S. over and over again in World Cup qualifying, in North American tournaments. And then in 1960, they chased the World Cup in 1970 from FIFA. They were awarded, and this upward trajectory just kept going and going and going. The United States at that time was going the other way. They just were going nowhere. One of my favorite bits of information was in 1945, the U.S. Soccer Association basically changed its name to the U.S. Soccer Football Association to distinguish itself from this sport that was going crazy in the country at that point, American football. And then in 1974, they changed it to the U.S. Soccer Federation. But it was nowhere in this country. And I think that it's important to know that the new league in Mexico, which was formed in 1943, was a big part of that. The Primera grew into one of the strongest leagues in the hemisphere. It didn't really do that until after the World Cup, frankly, but it was moving upwards at a very slow pace, whereas nothing was happening here. But again, television is so important because Televisa, the television giant in Mexico, they latched on to soccer in 1960 in a way that American broadcasting wouldn't catch on to soccer until the 1990s. Again, 20, 30 years behind. So in the pattern. So basically, the U.S. went nowhere. And even when we had NASL, Mexico just kept beating us over and over again in World Cup qualifying. And that's sort of the way it was until 1990. In 1980, there was a big match where we beat them, but it was not really a meaningful match. I'm sure we'll talk about that. But more the history and what the countries tell each other about themselves is important. Mexico believed that they were a first world nation once they had hosted the World Cup. They believed that they were a soccer power sort of waiting to happen. And the U.S. never cared about soccer. In fact, they didn't care about it because Mexico kept beating us. I mean, Mexico must be great, we told ourselves, because they keep beating us. But we were terrible, and the Mexicans weren't a whole lot better than us. The 90s were when everything converged. The U.S. actually did get good. And Mexico all of a sudden had this rival, this regional rival that it was used to beating up on, and they were playing them as equals, and they didn't like it. And that's what really fuels a rivalry, is this kind of sibling relationship where one element grows up, becomes an equal, and they start to prove it, and the older, more powerful sibling really does not like it. And when they become developmentally equal, then you can go back and forth and sort of trade punches. And that's what's been happening in the last 35 years.
Yes, and Mexico throughout the 50s and 60s regularly qualified to the World Cup. Maybe they didn't impress there, but at least they always qualified. It was a guarantee that they would qualify from this region around this time. Like you said, the United States somewhat stagnated in these decades.
Mhm.
But despite the advent of the NASL, that maybe did not have a beneficial effect on the national team.
No, but I should say that there was really no evidence other than Mexico's idea that it was growing as a soccer nation, that they were actually becoming a first tier soccer nation. They really only beat up on the United States and CONCACAF. I didn't realize this until I researched the book. Mexico never played a friendly outside of Mexico until 1961. Why not? They're curiously sort of careful about who they played. And they were sort of protecting their ego in this way. When they were chasing the World Cup, sort of like Qatar did, when they were bidding on that World Cup prior to 2010, I think is when it was awarded. They started barnstorming around the world, playing, friendlies everywhere to get better, but also to show that they had some cred as football nation. Mexico started to do this, but not until the 1960s. So of course, they had a good league at that time. One of the things that I think is important for everyone to remember is that Mexico is the biggest Spanish speaking country in the world in terms of population. It's also the richest Spanish speaking country, the one with the most, the biggest GDP, the biggest economy. So this was a place that didn't even have a very rich league until the 70s, until after the World Cup. It was getting better. They were producing good players, but they weren't spending any money. They weren't making any money until the 1970s. And that's when the US sort of saw, well, we should have our own league. Maybe that'll make us better. And it sort of did. But it's one of those things that I think people need to remember is that Mexico's got this idea that it's always been dominant. Well, they only dominated us. They built their reputation almost entirely on beating us, and we weren't very good.
Let's discuss that November 1980 World Cup qualifier that you mentioned earlier. So, this encounter was really a dead rubber as the United States were virtually eliminated because I believe they had lost the first leg 5-1.
Right.
However, the United States won this second leg, this inconsequential match, and this loss had a profound effect on Mexico. Can you describe the underlying reasons for such a reaction to a virtually meaningless match?
Yeah, I'll try. It's complicated. After the World Cup was held in Mexico in 1970, the Mexican Primera, their top division, really did have a flowering. And a lot of money was made. Televisa started broadcasting Mexican matches all over the Spanish speaking world. Those clubs got rich and they started attracting foreign talent. So that league got better and better and better. But the World Cup continued to go poorly for the Mexicans. They made the quarterfinals as host nations, but it was a small tournament, 16 teams, and you get out of your group, you're in the quarterfinals. So they had this league that they felt was growing, but they didn't qualify for the World Cup in 1974. Haiti went in its place. In 1978, they qualified out of CONCACAF and went to Argentina. They finished dead last. And then 1980 rolls around and they lose a World Cup qualifier to the United States for the first time, ever. And that was really a moment where the whole nation said, what is happening? We're slipping. We're not progressing. And when I first read those headlines in La Afición, which was the national sports daily, I quote it extensively in the book, I thought it was a little over the top. I thought they were overreacting. It's not fun to lose to little brother ever, no matter what, but it seemed like a one-off. But it really was more of an indication of where things were going than I had realized until I really dove into the history. All through the 70s, Televisa said, you know what? We should be having friendlies with the United States. We're making money. This could be an excellent exercise in beating up the gringos, and they now NASL is a thing. Let's have some events. And they played for the first time since 1937. They played 5 or 6 friendlies in the space of 3 or 4 years in the mid 70s. Every single one of those games was close. I couldn't believe it when I actually looked at the data. It was 1-0 and 2-1, and they weren't blown out by any means. And then the Mexicans are like, this is not what we got into this for. We got into this to win games 5-1. That's what Mexican viewers like to see. So this 1980 game came 5 years after those friendlies came to an end, and everyone freaked out and said, we're not progressing internationally. This is bad. And you know that they felt this way because the U.S. played Mexico one time afterwards in the 1980s. In 10 years, they played the United States one time. And also, they screwed up and failed to qualify for the 1982 World Cup. So it got even worse from their perspective. The next time they ran into the United States was in 1991 at the first CONCACAF Gold Cup. And the U.S. beat them again. And then they knew they were really in for a different kind of rival. One they saw coming, didn't want to see, didn't want to acknowledge. But come 1991, the U.S., if you read Generation Zero, they had turned in, finally created a generation of players that was decent on the men's side and the women's side. And everything changed from 1991 forward. But that 1980 game was the bellwether. It was a warning, and it's something that the players saw and commented on. But the federation, the fans, and the media, they weren't having it. They were just up in arms about having lost. This is a disgrace. We have to rethink the way we create players and reformat the Primera so that we're creating better players for international play. I'm not sure that ever happened, but they mostly coped by not playing the U.S. again until they had to.
Irrespective of sports, there are historical and cultural reasons that overlap both nations due to proximity. How do these work into the soccer consciousness of each nation?
Well, we share a massive border with them, for starters. And it's a border that for 2 or 3 centuries was only painted on a map, and that there was an extraordinary interchange of people and culture across that border, north and south, really that came with the seasons. When you look at the history of immigration, and I write a lot about it in the book, even when the United States was barring Asian immigrants, and after 1924, they sort of stopped the Eastern European immigration, the Ellis Island style immigration that I think we're most familiar with. There were carve outs in US law for Mexican labor because there was a recognition that you really couldn't run this country without that labor. So that creates a closeness. And irrespective of sports, it is 90% of what we're talking about. People from Mexico traveled north seasonally for a long time. And after a while, they said, well, why are we doing this seasonally? Let's, make our lives there. And they did. There's 50 million people of Mexican descent in this country. That's a lot. That's not 10%. That's way more. Don't ask me about math. The soccer consciousness part is where it gets really interesting, because I think one of the things that held soccer back in this country was this idea that it was a foreign sport played by foreigners. And Mexicans were a big part of that cognition by so-called Americans when they came to their sports. We don't want to play that. We want to play a sport that is created here: baseball, basketball, American football. Now, the roots of those sports are obviously English and not American wholly, but they saw soccer being played by Mexican immigrants and Polish immigrants and German immigrants all through the early part of the 20th century. And they didn't say that's an American sport, that's for those folks. And Mexicans played a big role in making that impression on the American sporting public. So that's a cultural influence. That's not really a sporting influence, but it does spill over into one of the reasons why soccer never really took off in this country until the late 20th century. It took a long time for us to get past that impression of the sport.
Is it fair to say that this rivalry is more important to Mexicans, as for much of its history, USA has not been a soccer nation? In fact, is there a resentment that USA is not a soccer country compared to Mexico?
Well, first of all, I think we have to make a distinction between Mexicans in Mexico and Mexican Americans who are here. Mexicans in Mexico definitely believe that the United States doesn't care about soccer that much, and for a long time they weren't wrong. And even now, they don't believe that we live it and care about it and love it the way we should, the way you must love it in order to be good. That's the way they think about it. Mexicans in Mexico are also way more interested in creating a rivalry with a better class of soccer nation. They would much rather be rivals with Argentina or Brazil. Now, Mexican Americans, they love the rivalry, and they would like to beat no one more than the United States, because it's a statement of identity amongst Mexican Americans. And again, there's 35, 50 million people who are here. And these are the folks who show up to all the friendlies that are played here and root for Mexico and tailgate. And it's not a political statement they're making. What they're actually saying is, we miss Mexico. This is a connection to our culture that we don't want to lose. And of course, we're going to root for Mexico against the United States, even though we're American citizens. We see this as a special place where we can neither be here nor there in a good way. They can choose to support Mexico on game day and then live as Americans the rest of their lives. So, on our side, it's complicated on the Mexican side, but I think we can understand how this works, even though it's unique in world football. I think all of us came from somewhere else, so we can all understand how you're never going to just throw away the heritage of your grandparents, for example, and say, I'm American, I don't want to talk about Germany, where I used to come from. No, it's all part of us. But for the Mexicans, it's very close. And it's not just close in terms of time, it's close in terms of proximity. And so that fuels the rivalry and the way they think about it in a way that it doesn't in this country. Now, from our perspective, there was a huge issue with soccer being perceived as this foreign thing that we shouldn't care about because it's not American enough. And that's a real thing that I think we've gotten past. But what we haven't gotten past is this idea of the United States playing team sports against other nations. It's something we really don't do, hardly at all. Did you watch the World Baseball Classic that was on a couple of weeks ago with Venezuela and the United States? Well, it was an amazing event. That's an American sport, right? The final was Venezuela against the United States, and the game was held in Miami. There were 60,000 Venezuelans in that stadium. They packed it. So anyone who saw that game knows that Americans have they lack an understanding of what international sports really mean, because that is a game that we created. That's our game. That's our national pastime. And the Venezuelans dominated that stadium just the way Mexican Americans dominates the stadiums when they play the United States north of the border. So the problem is that we just don't get it. All of our sports, all of our rivalries are domestic. They're insular in this way. Everywhere else in the world, you play your National Basketball League season, you crown a domestic champion, then all the best players get together on the national team and you go play Germany, or you go play Argentina in an international tournament, or, the FIBA World Championships. We just don't think that way. And we've never thought that way. And not until the early 1990s did we think about it at all. This is where FIFA really gets credit in my book. They gave the World Cup to a country that didn't just like soccer that much. They gave it to a country that didn't even understand what this tournament was. So that's the huge issue for the United States on this side of it, is that for a long time, we didn't understand what international team sports were about. We don't have a national soccer identity. I'm from Boston. I have a Red Sox identity. People, who support the LA Lakers, they have a Lakers fandom that they identify with and wear the clothes. Very few people walk around in U.S. national team jerseys. El Tri, the Mexican national team, they sell more national team jerseys in this country than they do in Mexico. So Mexicans understand how this works. Mexican Americans understand how this works. We're just getting started on this journey. I thought that, it's fascinating to me. A tournament like the World Baseball Classic shows sort of how far we have to go, but it also shows that when we get put into that situation, we enjoy it. I mean, people are still talking about the U.S. Soviet hockey game that was played at the Olympics in 1980. That was almost 50 years ago. And oh, by the way, it didn't result in a flowering of hockey in this country. But when given the opportunity, we get it. But when it comes time to actually doing it outside of the Olympic context, we are curiously cautious and sort of not interested. So soccer has always battled that problem in this country in a way that Mexico never did. And one of the things is that, when you're entirely domestic, all of your big rivalries are domestic. They're college football, they're baseball, they're NFL. So one of the great things about soccer in this country is that it gives us the opportunity to think internationally in this way. And if we just follow through with it, I think we'll create joy and angst and sporting interest out of it. And I think the women's national team has shown us how this works, frankly, better than the men's national team has. But they don't have a rival. They're too good. We have a rival that is right there on our doorstep and has big issues with us. We have just as many issues. This thing is in the news every day outside of the soccer context. We should embrace it because it's good fun.
Like you said, in the United States, the concept of say a national team call up is very foreign because you don't have that in the NFL or NBA. The only time you would have something, a context like that would be in the Olympics, which is every 4 years. Like you said, soccer is different because you do have these constant call ups, constant matches against other nations that doesn't really exist in an American sports culture.
No, and it all came to a head in the early 90s and the late 80s. And I know we'll talk about it more, but, soccer's not the only sport where this internationalism comes to the fore. It's the biggest one. It's the most popular sport in the world. The World Cup is the biggest event in the world. But all these things came together in the early 90s, right when the US and the Mexicans became rivals because they became equals. But look at the Ryder Cup. That's an international event that used to be nothing. Now it's a huge deal in golf. The Dream Team, the basketball Dream Team, came along in 1992, and right before the World Cup was held in this country. So these things, the America's Cup yachting race, I remember that was on ESPN in the late 80s. I was like, why are they putting this on TV? Because they thought they could make money, ESPN did, putting it on TV. So they did. And, after 30 years, we're finally in a position where we can appreciate it, but we're stuck in our ways. I mean, the NBA is still way more important than the FIFA World Championship. And you had to wait around for an Olympic gold medal to get really excited. But America, I remember someone from, Jim Trecker, who used to work for the Cosmos and worked at the U.S. Soccer Federation for many years in the communications media side. He says that in 1986, not only did no one realize that we had a national soccer team, they were like, wait a minute, so the World Cup is happening in Mexico, so Maradona plays for Argentina, right? Yes. Well, But you're saying that he also plays for a club team in Italy? Yes. It was so foreign to us, literally foreign, that it took a long time for us to get by it. We're still getting by it. It's quite amazing. And when the Dream Team happened, people got all excited, and everyone who actually knows soccer in this country is like, yeah, that's how it works. They play their own club teams, and then they get together and play on the. It's like an all-star team, yeah. And then they go play other countries. And the people are like, oh, that's awesome. We're like, yeah, we know.
Yeah, I remember that was looked upon as such a novelty, this
Yes.
uniting of the best players in the dream team. It seemed like such a foreign concept at the time, but of course, now I guess Americans are more used to that kind of a concept.
They are, but it's still secondary. It's still much more important that the basketball players win an NBA championship than win a FIBA World Championship or an Olympic gold medal in the great scheme of things, which other people in other countries they don't understand. But it's part of American exceptionalism, and that we don't really have we are the rival. We don't need rivals. Once the Soviet Union went away, they were our rival for 50 years on all things cultural and sport. That having been eliminated, we were able to move into this new era, but we weren't ready for it. We're still working on it.
So now in your book, the 1991 encounter in the Gold Cup is considered a reference point and perhaps the onset of the serious soccer rivalry between the nations. Can you explain why? Was it simply due to the fact that USA were to host the 1994 World Cup and therefore there was a necessity to improve for the Americans?
It was part of it, but it really wasn't the major role. I mean, Generation Zero played the most primary role. My first book was about this generation of players born in the 1960s, trained up as youth players in the 1970s. For the first time, we did that with soccer. We did a little league sort of soccer thing. We created real footballers for the first time. By 1990, these guys were 24, 25 years old, and they were good. They were good enough to play Mexico as equals. The women, of course, from that same generation were better than everyone on earth. And they won the first of many world championships in 1991. So it's the same group of Americans that made it happen. But the World Cup was something that everyone pointed to, but only starting in 1988. And in 1988, soccer was nowhere in this country. The Generation Zero was progressing. They were actually starting to come into their own as professionals and capable players. The most important development for that game and the rivalry was CONCACAF. CONCACAF had started in 1962. It was based in Mexico City. It was run by the Mexicans. They cared about football in a way that we didn't, and they had more money, power, and influence than anyone else in the region. So 1962, they combined the Caribbean Football Association with this North American Football Union. They created CONCACAF, and they had a tournament that they played every couple of years, every 4 years. It was not a regular thing. In 1990, they said, you know what? Well, they actually moved CONCACAF headquarters to Miami. Jack Warner from Trinidad and Tobago was named the president, and Chuck Blazer, an American, was his vice president. And Chuck Blazer was the guy who actually grew the television product around soccer almost single-handedly throughout the 90s. What did the Gold Cup mean? It was the Confederation Championship. Every confederation has one. We didn't really have one until then. And they recognized right away that here was an opportunity to make money, to sell television product to American broadcasters who up until that time didn't care. And when the United States beat Mexico in 1991 in the semifinal of the first Gold Cup, everyone said, oh, look at this. They drew 50,000 people to the Memorial Coliseum in LA. And all of a sudden, and the US won the tournament, all of a sudden, the Mexicans can't believe what has happened. This team that they thought was terrible beat them in a tournament that mattered, and they couldn't wait to play another Gold Cup. And they did it every 2 years. So in my mind, the Gold Cup game did many things, but it showed Mexico that the U.S. was a serious rival worth caring about. And it showed that the U.S.-Mexico was a cash cow. They knew that if they could put these teams, the national teams, in a tournament together every 2 years, they were going to get a U.S.-Mexico game more often than not, and it was going to get great ratings. It was going to grow the game in this country, in the U.S. It was going to light a fire under the rivalry in both countries, and it was going to make money for everybody. And that all happened before the World Cup was held in 1994. So obviously people wanted the 94 World Cup to go well. That was going to make money too. But I think the U.S. played Mexico 4 or 5 times before the World Cup was held in 1994. They couldn't get enough of this rivalry. And every time they held it at a place like the Rose Bowl, 100,000 people showed up to watch it. They knew, they're like, I think we're onto something here. So that was the turning point fiscally, but also competitively, 1991. You can't get away from that. I think U.S. politics also played a role. In 1990s were when we started caring about immigration as a political issue. People tried to run for president, like Pete Wilson, the senator and governor of from California, and Pat Buchanan. They were talking about America first back then because at that point, the drug situation in the United States was, most of them were coming over the border from Mexico. So Mexico was tainted with that, even if it wasn't the Mexicans actually bringing the drugs over. But that became a political issue, which just spiced up this rivalry even more. And Mexican Americans were already here by the millions. And when they show up 100,000 at a time inside the Cowboy Stadium and go crazy rooting for Mexico, that just makes Americans want to beat them. But it mostly makes television networks want to put it on TV, which is what they did.
Yeah, and the frequency increased in the 1990s, and the matches seemed to be more hyped. There was
Yeah.
the 1993 Gold Cup at Azteca that the Mexico won 4-0, and this kind of acted as sort of a revenge match. While the United States defeated Mexico 1-0 at the Rose Bowl, like you mentioned, just a few weeks before the World Cup. And after the World Cup in 1995, there were two encounters, one in the US Cup that the United States won 4-0, and just a few weeks later, United States eliminated Mexico in the Copa America I believe it was in
Uruguay.
Uruguay. Yeah, yes,
Yeah.
thank you. Yeah. As a result, was this rivalry at this point something more than it had been before?
Yeah, I think it went from 0 to 60 in 2 seconds. And we weren't really ready as a football culture in the United States to understand what was happening, but the Mexicans understood it implicitly. Here was the country this was the one thing that Mexicans had on the United States. They could beat us at soccer. And when we started playing them as equals and beating them in the 1990s, they weren't so sure they wanted this rivalry anymore. Mexicans in Mexico have always wanted to be rivals with a more glamorous, powerful soccer nation like Argentina or even Colombia, just better footballers, by reputation. But you asked about what cultural exchange, what geographic factors play into the rivalry. We're right there. We literal siblings. We have grown up together in this plot of land in North America, right next to each other for 300 years now. So it was right there. It was ripe. You couldn't avoid it. Eventually, the Mexicans began to accept the United States as a legitimate rival. But in the 90s, every single match from Mexican perspective was a chance to put down this uprising, to say to the United States, okay, fine. Yeah, you beat us. You knocked us out of the Copa America in 1995. Now we're going to resume our proper place as the giant of CONCACAF. And it's interesting to hear media and commentators talk about this idea of being the giant of CONCACAF. Most people who know world football wouldn't brag about being the giant of CONCACAF because it's not a powerful confederation, but it was this way that Mexico looked at themselves. And when we started beating them in the 90s, they couldn't say that anymore. And I think they beat us in the 93, the next Gold Cup, very soundly at the Azteca in Mexico City, 4-0. And that was what all the papers were saying. Once again, we are the rightful, proper giant of CONCACAF. But we have to be. Yeah, we're the only country in CONCACAF that is good enough and powerful enough and loves soccer enough. They all say that. They all say, the United States doesn't love soccer enough to be the giant of CONCACAF. Well, we've become pretty good without loving it the way the Mexicans do. So be it. But that 1980 game that we talked about, that was not on TV in the United States. It just wasn't on anywhere. And so that's how far we came in 10 years. All of a sudden, the networks said, yeah, we need to put this game on. We need to set up friendlies. We need to create these tournaments that will showcase these two teams. Make sure Honduras and Costa Rica are there. They're also good. But we want these two teams to play. People might not remember it if they're not old enough. But, you have the Gold Cup. That's CONCACAF's vehicle for showing us U.S.-Mexico. World Cup qualifying. That's FIFA's and the federation's vehicle for showing us U.S.-Mexico. But the U.S. Soccer Federation actually created an event called the U.S. Cup, which they controlled, and they invite Mexico, maybe Colombia, maybe Peru, but you're going to get a U.S.-Mexico game in there, and there were some great ones all through the 90s. It was just a question of getting them on TV together, showing them full stadiums full of crazed Mexican fans dressing up and watching them beat on each other because that's what they did. These were all great matches. And those generations of U.S. players, I take my hat off to them because they never played a home game. They never played a home game all through the 90s.
Now, delving more into the cultures, in your book, you discussed the idea of scorn and envy. Essentially, each side scorns and envies the other for different reasons. Can you explain it further and how that works into soccer?
Well, these are psychological sort of goalposts that aren't dreamed up by sports writers. They're legitimate objects of study, by scholars of psychology. I didn't stumble upon them. Other folks have talked about how envy and scorn work in rivalry specifically. College football, for example, is a great example. It's when you look at rivalries in American sporting culture, those are some of the most crazed ones we have. I mean, I talked to Dr. Andre Markovitz for this book. He wrote a whole 100-page scholarly essay on Ohio State and Michigan. He teaches at Michigan. And one of the things he said to me that struck me was, he said, we scraped the Twitter accounts of Ohio State fans ahead of the Michigan game. And they spoke about Michigan 5 times more often than Michigan talked about Ohio State. And he said, that's the thing about scorn. When you scorn a rival, you don't talk about them. Scorn is silent. Envy is very yappy. Envy is little brother saying, hey, I want a piece of you. I want a piece of you now. I can beat you now. So these are things that we recognize from being in families. If you have a big brother or a little brother, big sister or little sister, you sort of get how this works, but they are the building blocks of rivalry, envy and scorn, which I had not realized until I got into the research. So envy needs no explanation. I'm a Red Sox fan. I envy New York Yankees success, right? That makes sense. Scorn is harder to recognize because it's mainly silent. For Mexico, to discuss the U.S. as a rival prior to 1990, it was beneath them. And the sibling framing is so apt. I have a little brother. I'm not proud of the way I treated him growing up, but I didn't want to explain to my parents why I didn't want him hanging out with my friends. I just wanted him gone. And that's the way, scorn works in international football. Germany is a rival with Holland. But the Germans don't sit around talking about Holland and, oh, they've got a big game with Holland. They're above that. They scorn Holland because they're a bigger, more powerful footballing nation that has won World Cups. The Dutch, they want a piece of Germany every freaking time because Germany is the big brother. And also, they occupied their country during World War II. So they've got a history with them, just like we have it with Mexico. And one of the things so envy and scorn are sort of the goalposts that we measure rivalry with. But what makes the North American derby, U.S.-Mexico, unique is this. Most rivalries have envy going one way and scorn the other. International rivalry especially, there's nothing that Argentina envies about Brazil. They only scorn them. It's scorn both ways. They just hate them. But Mexico, Mexicans do envy American wealth and influence, while at the same time scorning us for not loving football enough, right? And U.S. soccer fans traditionally envy, Mexican fan culture. And for a long time, they had a great league and we didn't have one, while scorning, their outsides. When we got, in the 90s, we started saying, why does everyone think that Mexico is a great soccer power? They can't even beat us. They've never won anything. So we scorned them back way. This envy and scorn going in both directions is completely unique in world soccer. So that's what makes the rivalry so vibrant and meaningful, is that we have this dynamic that no one else does on earth. Spain and Portugal, they live right next to each other. They have an incredible cultural rivalry, and they're great soccer nations. But no one talks about playing. They only play each other when they have to. Same thing with Argentina and Brazil. They play when they have to. They don't set up friendlies to play more games. They would rather just scorn them and talk about them as little as possible. And if they have to play them, they'll do their best. But is that a rivalry? It's a weird one. It doesn't work like the United States and Mexico is, where we're playing all the time. Frequency is another ingredient, along with envy and scorn, that makes a rivalry work. And we've played Mexico 50 times since 1995. And I think that Argentina and Brazil have never played outside of World Cup qualifying since 1993 or something like that. I don't play friendlies. You don't play friendlies with people you only scorn. You do that over and over again with people that you admire and people that you scorn at the same time. And that's what makes the North American derby unique.
Despite all the differences, the nations are also linked as many Mexican nationals are born in the United States. Therefore, there's the issue of identity, whereby culturally they may be Mexicans, yet they are Americans. This creates a situation where both nations try to attract the talent. Can you describe this phenomenon and its effects over the decades?
Well, there was no exchange of talent like this until the 1990s. And even then, it was sort of verboten. No one of Mexican heritage would play for the United States unless they weren't good enough to play for Mexico. And in many ways, that has not changed. But let's back up. Today, 35, 50 million Mexican Americans living in this country, they're all over the U.S. under 15 national team, under 17 national team, under 21 national team. But today's rules allow them to play at the same time for the Mexican U17 team and the U.S. U17 team. They haven't declared for one country or the other, something they need to do when they're 21. And you're not cap tied, you're not tied to one nation or the other until you play a senior match, for one country or the other. And even then, you can file a one-time switch with FIFA. So again, this is the single organism that we have created with Mexico. There, Brandon Vasquez, he trained with Tijuana growing up in San Diego. He goes across the border to get his football training, but he plays for the United States. And there are all sorts of players who are born in this country or travel to this country after their parents have moved up here. They are trained up by the U.S. Federation, to play on the national teams, but they end up choosing to play for Mexico. So I think it's important to point out that there's this cross-pollination that, again, feeds this rivalry in a way that no countries have this kind of exchange. And this sort of understanding that we're both going to chase Ricardo Pepi to be on our national teams. And then when he decides who we play for, we'll go from there. But everyone says, oh, you have to decide. Well, they don't have to decide until they're 21, until they play senior matches. But the important thing to remember is that the United States has never taken a real star from Mexico. The pull from the Mexican heritage side is still stronger. And that there's not a single player that the Mexicans say, oh, that one got away. Pepe would be the first one. And, he's just not there yet. All the players, when it comes down to it, if they're really good, they end up going to play for Mexico. But this pool of talent, that both teams vie for is unique in the same way that the Leagues Cup, this tournament that MLS and Liga MX cooperate on every year, and they shut down their leagues, for a month in August to compete against each other and put Liga MX teams against MLS teams. That's not done anywhere in the world. And, those games are broadcast by Televisa and they're broadcast by Fox Sports. I mean, it's one culture. It's one soccer ecosystem that we both participate in today. But come the national team, we go to our separate corners and they compete so hard against each other. So, yeah, the Mexican nationals, I think, have played an underrated role in the way soccer has grown in both countries. In the 20s and 30s and 40s in the previous century, they all had clubs, in Chicago and LA and San Francisco competing in the ethnic leagues. And they were part of the reason that Americans didn't want to play soccer or didn't want to follow it, because it's like, oh, look at all these foreigners playing this game. That's not our game. But come the 90s, they're the ones who juiced the U.S.-Mexico rivalry and made it a huge television event, because 100,000 people would show up and go crazy in the stands and tailgate for hours on both ends. So they had a big part in that equation. In the 21st century, before MLS took all their games and put them on Apple TV, if you put a game on Televisa Universal, TUDN, it would outdraw every game that was aired by Fox Sports and ESPN. Mexicans in this country watch football, and they'll watch it on Fox, they'll watch it on ESPN, and they'll watch it on Universal. They are driving the growth of soccer in this country in a real way. And without them, the rivalry wouldn't be the same. This dynamic of the Mexicans national team coming to the United States and, playing as the home team, again, it just doesn't happen anywhere else. And it happens over and over again. So it's a unique relationship, and you can't get away from it, and nor should you. It makes us richer. It literally makes us richer. There's more money to be made, but it makes us richer culturally. And I think it has improved both national teams, this sparring across the border when the United States needed a rival, to get better in the 90s. Mexico was there. Even though Mexico didn't want us to be their rival at first, eventually they gave into it and they said, no one else in CONCACAF is as good as these Americans. We may as well take them seriously because we don't get great games against teams in CONCACAF. We don't get to play rivals or equals that often. So it has served everyone in 50 different ways.
The most important match between the nations took place in the 2002 World Cup in Japan and Korea. So this is on June 17, 2002, with the United States defeating Mexico 2-0 in the second round of the World Cup. And this was the beginning of the whole 2-0 concept. Now, is it the context that made it so important and memorable? And of course, it has become more important in Mexico because of the place of the game in the nation.
2002 was the breaking point for all of people in Mexico who didn't want to recognize the United States as the rival. They didn't want to recognize the games we played against Mexico as a proper Clásico. They kept saying, they're not good enough. They don't love it like us. And you have to put it in context. The 90s were very, very even. I think we played them in the 90s 22 times. I think the United States won 7, lost 7, and tied 8 times. That's equal. You can't get any more equal than
Yeah,
that.
they would usually defeat each other at home.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And they tied a lot of games too. That was the first time we ever got a point at the Azteca was in 1997 during a World Cup qualifier. So yes. So that was the context, is that, well, we'd still much rather be rivals with Brazil. Well, in the late 90s, this got even more pointed because Mexico won the Confederations Cup, which is the second most important men's tournament sponsored by FIFA. They beat Brazil in the final to do it at home. It was an amazing game. And then 3 years later, they nearly won the Copa America held in Colombia. They lost in the final. So at that point, they were like, we've graduated to a new level. The Americans are good. They'll always be a rival, but they don't win trophies. They don't get invited to Copa America and nearly win it. So after that 90s, the equality of it, they thought they had risen to a new level. 2002 showed them that they had not. To get the United States in the World Cup and be beaten in such a public way and so convincingly was a traumatic day for Mexicans. It's still talked about that way. It landed like a physical trauma. So the context is important. And from that moment, I think they committed to playing the United States as their primary rival in a new way for reasons that I think we can understand, because they were embarrassed and they didn't ever want to be embarrassed like that again. You mentioned 2-0. That was another thing that changed the relationship. You're right. The Mexicans had a home field advantage that we just did not have throughout the 1990s. Starting in 2001, we created one by holding World Cup qualifiers, for example, in small MLS-owned stadiums, selling tickets, 90% of them to MLS club season ticket holders, and letting a few Mexicans in where they can't dominate the proceedings. That made a huge difference. The Mexicans couldn't beat us in Columbus, Ohio, for example, I think for 16 years. And we played them every World Cup cycle in Columbus and beat them. And the score was always 2-0. So hence the 2-0, which really became sort of a taunt and a chant. But it's really a match citing strategy, It's how do we create a home field where if we play at Soldier Field, 80,000 Mexicans will show up. How do we give our players a home field advantage? So there was a shift in 2002 out of embarrassment. And you don't change people's minds about something so important without that kind of trauma. We see this in other ways, in other sports. The English, for example, they didn't want to recognize even the World Cup, until 1950. They didn't attend one until then. But then they went to Brazil and they lost to the United States in like the biggest upset in the world. And then they lost to the Hungarians 2 years later in London. All of a sudden, the English are like, okay, we like the World Cup. We want to win it. That's the way the Mexicans changed their mind. They're like, oh, we're not going to talk about you guys not loving football anymore. We're just going to beat you. And that has made the rivalry sort of jump up a level or two since 2002.
For financial reasons, the Mexican national team has for decades played friendly matches north of the border, taking for granted the massive support that they will get.
Yeah.
Now, how is this policy regarded, and how would you compare the American based Mexico fans compared to the Mexico fans in general?
This is really interesting. I went to Guadalajara to watch the US Mexico friendly that was held there in October of. It was the only time I could see the two teams play while I was writing this book. And they played it in Guadalajara because the Azteca was being renovated. But one of the things I noticed is that there was no dressing up in Guadalajara. They supported the team and they won the game 2-0. So there was never any danger of them not winning. But they wore their national team jerseys, their favorite ones, just like you see anywhere in the world now. But it was a very, very different atmosphere than it was for games that are held at the Rose Bowl, for example. Again, Mexicans in Mexico, they support the national team. They love the national team. And they want to beat the United States very badly now. But for Mexican Americans who travel to the Rose Bowl or to the LA Coliseum to watch El Tri play the US, that is an assertion of identity that changes the atmosphere and it changes the stakes for everyone in the stadium. The folks in Guadalajara, the people who live there, they know who they are. They don't have to assert their Mexicanness. Mexican Americans in the Rose Bowl at a Derby game, that's what they feel like they need to do. They need to dress up. They need to get there at 6 in the morning so they can, barbecue and make carne asada in the parking lot and drink Modelo for hours and hours before the game. What they're doing, and this was explained to me by a bunch of different Mexican Americans, they are not just asserting their identity as Mexican Americans, they are remembering Mexico. That for one day they could be Mexican again without having to move back there. One of the things they all talk about is that the culture of Mexico is, you go over to people's house and they feed you and you watch the football on TV or you play the football. It's a big family event. They treat these games, these friendlies, as that kind of event. And in that way, it's a great thing. I mean, for this massive population of Americans who are expatriates, a lot of them are dual nationals, to be able to remember where they came from and to assert their Mexicanness again in a friendly way that doesn't threaten anyone. But the people in Mexico want to see friendlies too. And when I went to Guadalajara, the national team hadn't played in Guadalajara since 2010, 14 years. Guadalajara is the third largest city in the country. It's a huge football town. I think in the book I wrote that since 2005, the Mexican national team has played 172 friendlies, 20 years of friendlies. I think 126 of them were held in the United States because it's a money grab. Of course, they're providing Mexican Americans with this chance to be nostalgic and connect with their Mexican heritage. But mostly the Federación, the FMF, they want to make money. And they can put 80,000 people in the Rose Bowl and charge them in American dollars. That's what they're going to do. I spoke a lot to Marion Reimers, who is a super talented journalist. She calls games for TNT, Mexico, Champions League, and what have you. She's tremendous. And she's a really clever, astute observer of the cultural sort of byplay in the US-Mexico rivalry. And she comes right out and says that this is a prostitution of these people who, love football and love Mexico. It's basically a money grab. And it's sort of a downwashing. You've heard about the sport washing that they do to rinse their hands of any sort of bad connotations that are attached to this. It's not money laundering, but it's plucking money from this group of Mexicans, or these dual nationals, who will do anything to assert their Mexican heritage. So it's a really interesting development. And again, it doesn't exist anywhere on earth. The closest thing that I decided that mimics this dynamic is in Turkey. No, it's not in Turkey. It's in Germany, where there's 7 million guest workers of Turkish heritage that some have become citizens, and some have maintained that guest worker status. They think of themselves as German. They are German. But when Turkey comes and plays a national team game in Germany, they freak out. They show up en masse and they love their football. And we're going to get to see the Turks up close because they're in our group come this summer. They won that playoff. So, but it doesn't exist anywhere else. Think about it this way. If Argentina played Brazil in a friendly, which they don't do, but suppose it's a World Cup qualifier, and all of a sudden 70,000 Brazilians showed up in Buenos Aires to watch the game, to get in the stadium, there would be chaos. They wouldn't even play the game. It would be fights galore. This is the kind of balance that the US and Mexico have struck in their own football culture. The idea that you can do this, you can have the US playing a home game in front of 80,000 people rooting for the other team, still compete and win, but they've created, this completely unique rivalry and a completely unique partnership. That's why I use the word codependent in the subhead of the book. In so many ways, we've relied on Mexicans to advance the game, Mexican Americans, and in so many ways, Mexican Americans have supported the United States, because when the United States is not playing El Tri, I would say half of the Mexican Americans are rooting for the United States against everyone else. They're Americans, but it's this really interesting relationship with the game and with the country they live in, even when immigration as an issue is just a white hot issue. This continues. It's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out during the World Cup. When Mexico plays a knockout round match in LA or someplace, who knows? But soccer, football in North America has worked these matters out, and there's a détente. We understand how it works. I'm hoping for the best this summer, Sean, but I don't know how it's going to go.
To circle back to the idea of resentment, in the simplest terms possible, is there a feeling from Mexicans that Americans are essentially Johnny come latelys into a sport that has been part of their culture?
Not anymore, but until 2002, I think they did feel that way. I think all through the 90s, they felt that way. And they kept waiting for them to reassert themselves as dominance when it came to soccer. But the US is for real. We're not Brazil, and they're not Argentina, but they're very well matched. The Mexicans have sort of rounded into form for this World Cup, whereas the United States is not done that yet. So I'm sure that they would love it if we went out at the group stage or lost in the first round. So they still are our fierce rival, and there are still dozens of cultural reasons why Mexicans and Mexican Americans will be rooting for El Tri to do well, and we're rooting for the United States maybe to not do so well. But is that resentment? Sure. I think it's envy and scorn working in tandem. But one of the things that the rivalry and the competition on the field does not allow Mexicans to do is ignore the history. The Americans since 1980 have played them as equals, and the record shows that over and over again. And when we get on a neutral field at a World Cup, it's even better for us because we're so used to playing home games against Mexico, against hostile crowds. So it's very complicated. And the U.S. started out as a soccer nation faster and better than Mexico. They grew past us, and now we have grown together. And what is most amazing is that we are actually cooperating now on a level that no two nations on earth will even attempt. Can you imagine if like the Portuguese First Division and the Spanish La Liga like suspended play in the middle of the season to play a tournament against each other? I mean, no one does that. Um, so, yeah, I think that we saw, to answer your question, we saw that same resentment, but all that stopped in 2002. That's why there's really a before and after situation with that date. And the Mexicans will be the first ones to tell you that.
But nevertheless, there's always more pressure on Mexico when facing the United States.
Yes, I think that's fair enough. And I think that they have expectations that are naturally higher, but they'll always be the big brother in their brain. They'll always feel like they should win against the United States, especially at home. I think they'll always be searching to restore this idea that this is the one thing where we beat the Yankees, the Yankee. We beat them because we're better than them at this, and they can't take that away from us. So part of their thinking is that they hope that they can restore this some way, but I don't think it's going to happen. The sad part is that I don't know that we'll ever play Mexicans again in a World Cup qualifier. If we stay with a 48 team tournament and 6 or 8 teams from CONCACAF go to the World Cup every 4 years, they're never going to put the US and Mexico in the same qualifying group, So that's a loss. I mean, those are some of the best games I've ever seen, were those qualifying matches in the Azteca and in Columbus in this century, and they were extraordinary for the rivalry. And If we only played Mexico, in friendlies going forward, that would suck. Nations League would fill the void a little bit, but it's not the same. The stakes are always going to be highest.
In closing, by now, has this rivalry become, as you call it, a codependent rivalry that improves each side's program financially or otherwise?
Yeah, I think it does. As we touched on, in the 90s when Mexico needed a proper regional rival, we were there for them. And when we needed a proper rival to bring us up to their level, to show our populace how international sports worked, they were there. As we can see through all this cooperation, the codependence is good for the training up of national team players who will choose Mexico or the United States. I think that one of the things that I learned, and I think it was Marion who talked about it, is that the Leagues Cup is really a strategy from MLS and Liga MX to create a product that can compete with the Champions League and the English Premier League. In the digital world, what did she say? She goes, when you hear people talk about the Clasico in Guatemala, they're not talking about some local match. They're talking about Real Madrid and Barcelona. That's the world we live in. You can watch that game every time it's on. And in that kind of world, you need to have a product that is North American, that is big enough that people here in the United States and Mexico will watch. So we are codependent in that way because that's why they're cooperating so much, these two leagues. So in all these different, and that makes money for everyone. I don't think that, and now I think Americans have started to buy. Foreign ownership is starting to happen in Liga MX, which they have resisted for a long time. But they are actually following the MLS model more than they're following any other model. What do I mean by that? Well, there used to be promotion and relegation in Liga MX. Not anymore. They got rid of it during COVID, and they're not going back because they see MLS doing. They're like, why do we do that? People are going to come and invest in buying a club in the League MX. They're not going to want to go down. I mean, they would lose everything. I mean, so they're talking about capping the salaries the way MLS does. They're learning from MLS in a way that only a partner would learn. So yeah, I think that it's codependent and it's going to become more and more this way. Eventually, when we get past this period of xenophobia with regard to Mexico, it's going to kick back in, and there's going to be a lot more cooperation across the border when it comes to soccer. And at some point, the Mexican women's team is going to get good and become a proper rival to the U.S. women's team, and then we're going to have it from both sides, men and women. So yeah, I see it continuing. I wish they were going to play more in World Cup qualifying, but I think that's where the Nations League comes in. I think that they see that as the place where they're going to get U.S. Mexico games that mean something every year. They don't even have to wait for a World Cup qualifying, cycle to make that happen. So yeah, I see it continuing, and I see both teams, moving forward, in terms of their ability to compete with the South American clubs as well, because there's too much money and too much effort being made to bring them up in that way. And I hope they actually latch on to Copa America. I hope Copa America becomes a hemispheric championship and not just a South American championship. I think that's sort of the next step in what I'm talking about, is that, look what UEFA has done. That's an entire continent that has a championship, and they didn't combine confederations to do that. Maybe CONMEBOL doesn't want to do that, but eventually North American football is going to grow by this type of cooperation and codependence.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview and to remind everyone that all our respective contact information and the links to your books are included on the blog and podcast uploads. So, Hal, thank you once again and hope to continue these discussions on soccer history.
It's
Thank you.
my pleasure, Sean. I'd love to come back and do it again.
Thank you, Hal.
Bye bye.